following is an excerpt from the book Wounded Knee, 1890, The End of the Plains Indian Wars, by Tom Striska. One of the warriors, Black Coyote, was holding his rifle out above his head for all to see. He would not give up his gun, he shouted, without being paid for it. Two cavalrymen grabbed Black Coyote from behind and began wrestling with him. The Indian's rifle rose into the air and went off. Yellow Bird, who had begun speaking and gesturing again, threw a handful of dirt into the air. A group of Miniconjou then threw off their blankets, leveled their rifles at K-Troop, and fired a volley at the soldiers. Lieutenant Mann gave the order, "Fire! Fire on them!" Standing perhaps a dozen yards distant, K-Troop, from the south, and B-Troop, on the west side, fired directly into the Indians on the eastern edge of the council grounds. Bullets flew across the square in all directions as the troops positioned on the edges of the meeting ground fired toward the center. Bigfoot and the other band chiefs near him were killed immediately. Captain Wallace, rushing back toward K-Troop, died from a shot to the head, a shot which may have come from a cavalryman's gun. Most of the warriors rushed toward the Miniconjou camp lying just past the line of soldiers. Others broke across the road toward G-Troop. The cavalrymen and the Miniconjou fought at close range with knives and revolvers. A slashing knife nearly took away Philip Wells's nose. One of the reporters at the scene took up a gun and began firing at the Indians. Colonel Forsyth fled the square and raced up to the Hotchkiss battery, commanded by Captain Alan Capron. As the warriors broke away from the square, the men of B and K troops moved back toward the cavalry camp. Unable to distinguish friendly cavalry from the Indians, Capron had held his fire until the melee ended and the two sides had separated. Now, with the gunners aiming for the small groups of scattering Indians, all four guns opened at once. The shells streamed across the battlefield and toward the Miniconjou village. Shrapnel sprayed into the teepees, several of which began burning. Terrified, the Miniconjou women grabbed their children and ran for the shallow, dry ravine that cut behind the camp. The warriors followed them, drawing fire from the line of dismounted soldiers of A and I troops who stood on the ravine's opposite edge. As the Miniconjou fled west and east along the ravine, the Hotchkiss crews began training their guns on the ditch. Shells exploded against the ravine walls and bottom, killing men, women, and children. A small group broke away to the west, following the ravine in a desperate search for shelter. The Ogalla scouts scattered, while C and D troops formed skirmish lines and advanced. Troop E moved down from its hill and into the ravine. The Miniconjou were still fighting in the ravine, facing hostile units shooting back from nearly all sides. A brûlé named Turning Hawk later testified that the men who escaped that first fire got into the ravine, and as they went along up the ravine, they were pursued on both sides by the soldiers and shot down. The women were standing off at a different place from where the men were stationed, and when the firing began, those of the men who escaped the first onslaught went in one direction up the ravine, and then the women, who were bunched together at another place, went entirely in a different direction through an open field, and the women fared the same fate as the men who went up the deep ravine. The ravine had become a death trap for dozens of Miniconjou women and their children. Desperately digging for shelter in the cold ground, the women were cut down by the rapid-fire Hotchkiss guns that were raining shells down from Cemetery Hill. Indian men, women, and ponies then broke away from the ravine and began running toward the agency road. The soldiers of C and D troops opened fire on the fleeing group, killing them singly and in groups. Another group of Miniconjou fled several hundred yards to the west, where men, women, and children collected in the shelter of a sharp bend. Here a group of about 25 warriors kept up the last resistance, exchanging fire with several units until a group of scouts advanced and negotiated a ceasefire. In the meantime, Philip Wells had rushed up to the edge of the ravine and called out, "All of you who are still alive, Give up and come on over. You will not be molested or shot at any more." Some of the wounded raised themselves and began to climb past the bodies scattered on the ravine slopes. The bodies of the Minikanju warriors and soldiers of K and B troops lay along the battlefield. Bigfoot and his fellow chiefs lay dead, along with more than 100 Minikanju men, women, and children. Father Francis Kraft, a Catholic priest who had been present at the disarming, began giving last rites to the dying, even after suffering a stab wound that collapsed one of his lungs. The cavalry soldiers placed the wounded on wagons, and the regiment marched the 15 miles back to Pine Ridge Agency. A church there served as a field hospital, managed by Dr. Charles Eastman. We laid the poor creatures side by side in rows, and the night was devoted to caring for them as best we could. Many were frightfully torn by pieces of shells, and the suffering was terrible. The Indian women, terrified by the sight of blue uniforms, would not allow the army surgeons to approach them. The gunfire at Wounded Knee carried across the hills and plains of the Pine Ridge Reservation. One settler recalls hearing the shots, then riding into the agency to seek permission to leave in search of his brother.